Hello and welcome to Aliens Revealed Live. I'm your host Dean Caparella here on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. From alien abductions to monster-infested ranches, men in black, near-death experiences, close encounter experiences and more, we speak to some of the most amazing people on the planet, ready and willing to share their chilling stories with you. And they all come from the Aliens Revealed Live files here on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. Well, true UFO abduction stories don't come much scarier than Terry Lovelace's experience at Devil's Den in 1977. It completed a trifecta of true alien abduction events during a frightening 4-year period in the 1970s. The Pascagoula incident in 1973 involving Calvin Parker and Charles Hickson captured worldwide interest and a media frenzy. It was matched by the Travis Walton abduction near Snowflake in Arizona in 1975. It was later portrayed on the big screen in the movie Fire in the Sky. But for sheer terror, the incident at Devil's Den State Park in Arkansas is hard to match. Lovelace wrote a book simply titled Incident at Devil's Den, a true story by Terry Lovelace detailing what happened to both he and his friend Toby on that fateful night. Lovelace and his friend were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Their abduction happened during a short leave excursion from the Air Force. They decided to take a camping trip, and rather than go to an area where other campers would be nearby, they went off the beaten track a little for some real solitude. It was a decision that would have a major implication for them, and it wasn't long before they had some unwanted visitors. The Devil's Den incident probably hasn't received the same fanfare as Pascagoula or Snowflake, but make no mistake, it commands the same magnitude of chilling experience. Lovelace kept quiet about his ordeal for 35 years, eventually coming out in 2012 to tell his story. He's got physical evidence to prove what he went through really happened. The former Assistant Attorney General for the U.S. Territory of American Samoa is hoping others will follow suit and also tell their stories. He now spends a lot of his time fulfilling speaking engagements, and by telling his story, he may encourage others who have kept quiet to come forward. Not in a public sense, though, but through safe counsel where they can at least get their experience off their chest in a safe environment. In an interview during the Aliens Revealed Live online summit, Lovelace produced some startling evidence of another abduction episode. It seems when ET has your number, they become repeat visitors. Terry Lovelace joins us now. Welcome, Terry.
Thank you, Dean. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I mentioned the word disturbing. I've heard this story, and I've read the book and listened to your interviews on radio, and it really does send chills up the spine. So, walk us through the abduction event and tell us when it happened and where.
Sure. From 1973 to 1979, I was active duty in the United States Air Force. And a coworker of mine, actually a good friend, suggested that we go to Devil's Den, which was about 6 hours south of where we were stationed at Whiteman Air Force Base in western Missouri. I was an amateur photographer. I had a dark room set up, and my friend Toby and I we lived on base in NCO housing. And there's not a lot that you can photograph on a strategic air command base. We had, B-52s with nukes and a contingent, a squadron of Minutemen II ICBMs. So security was tight and photography was frowned upon. I wanted to get away and photograph eagles, so that was kind of the purpose of the exercise. My friend, on the other hand, was an amateur astronomer who just lived to watch the night sky. He could identify the constellations. He was taking physics classes and hoped to go to University of Michigan and major in physics when his enlistment ended. So we made the trip down to Devil's Den, which I didn't know at the time has a long and dark past, a crazy long and dark past. I don't have time to go into here, but we didn't stay in the campground. It was Toby's idea to dodge the park rangers and make this kind of a wilderness adventure. So I call it more like remote camping. We drove deep into the park And we came to, well, the road degraded from pavement to gravel to dirt to just two ruts in the road. And we came to an area that with a chain across it and a sign kind of intimidating, no admittance, no hiking, camping, fishing, trespassing, blah, blah, blah. And I thought, well, we have to turn around and find another route. But my friend Toby said, wait a minute. And he hops out of the car, and the chain across the road was attached to a post. The chain had just been locked on itself to form a loop and draped over the post. So he just picked it up and dropped it to the ground. Mm-hmm. And we were elated. We drove in and tried to stay on an upward climb, on an incline. If you, I have some photographs from Google Earth of the site where we camped on my Facebook page, marked the Incident at Devil's Den page. And I was surprised. I would have expected this area to have been grown with 40-year-old mature trees by now, but it's not. And when you zoom in close, you can see that the grass is cut and there's not a tree on it. It's just this triangular shape landing pad, for lack of a better word. It's on a high plateau, flat as a pool table. And that's where we had the misfortune to set up our camp. It was our first night, and everything went pretty well. You know, we did the usual things you do when you camp. You burn some hot dogs and that kind of stuff. But toward the evening, we had a little tent set up, a couple inflatable air mattresses, and some blankets we borrowed from the hospital. And we were both assigned to the hospital squadron as medics, EMTs. Mm-hmm. And we are kicked back on these air mattresses. And I recall saying to Toby, I said, man, this must be the allure of camping. I can see why people like this. It's pleasant. And he said, yeah, man, I told you this would be fun. And we're just kind of chatting. And there came a lull in our conversation. And I noticed that the sounds of the forest, the crickets, the tree frogs, and the forest insects that had been so loud just 15 or 20 minutes earlier were now dead silent. Even the breeze that we had enjoyed earlier had stopped. And it was dead still. And that sounds cliche, I know, but that's what happened. And it was akin to getting in an audio booth and shutting the door. It was that quiet. And it unnerved me. And I asked my friend, Toby, is this normal? I mean, it's awful quiet out here. And he just blew it off and said, yeah, you know, we've been laughing and cutting up. You know, the noises, they'll be back. Don't worry about it. No big deal. But I did fret about it. It was disconcerting to me. And we continued light conversation until my friend turned to the left and said, hey, man, were those lights there before? And I'm like, what are you talking about? And he points out on the horizon, there are 3 stars, each one about the same luminosity, same brightness as the North Star. So they were pretty bright. And they formed a tight little triangle that sat just above the horizon. They were too far above the horizon to have been lights from traffic or a train. But they were really too low, and they were stationary, so they couldn't be aircraft. So, you know, we were kind of puzzled by them. And we're debating what these things are when they moved. And at first they rotated and they turned like they were on an axis, about a 3/4 turn. And then they started to move up into the sky. And that's when I first felt this feeling of calm wash over me. The uneasiness and the anxiety that I felt earlier when the forest fell quiet was all gone. I felt relaxed. You know, our reaction to this thing was inappropriate. We should have ran for the car and got out of there.
Do you think you were being manipulated that early?
Absolutely, we were. No question in my mind. We may have even been manipulated to find our way to this spot. You know, in retrospect, I've noted that it was almost as if Toby knew where to go. He chose the location, and as we're driving in, there were many forks in the road. And I gave him credit because he did have an innate, unerring sense of direction. So when he said turn right, I'd turn right. But it seemed like he knew where to go. He took us there. Mm-hmm. And when we arrived, I wanted to camp right in the middle of the campground, but he was insistent. No, we got to camp back by the tree line. And he was so insistent on that, it kind of puzzled me. But the importance of that became apparent a couple hours later. So the lights climbed into the sky. Well, the setting was there were just 1 trillion stars out that night. There wasn't a cloud in the sky. We had zero light pollution, and we were on elevated ground. So we could see the Milky Way, we could see the constellations. It really was just breathtaking. But as this triangle thing moved up, we could see that it was a solid object. The points of light always remained equidistant to one another. So it wasn't 3 separate objects in unison. Because there was so much starlight, the area inside the triangle was black against the blue sky. And it picked up speed and gained an altitude of, I don't know what, but it gained some altitude, stopped, and then began a descent. And as it descended, it was pretty obvious it was headed in our direction.
Right.
And it did a tumbling and turning kind of movement where it would do somersaults, and there would be 2 points of light, and then the other apex of the triangle would come around to the top and form a triangle again.
Was it noisy?
No, never heard a thing at that time. Never heard a thing. And I remember thinking, that this thing, the thought crossed my mind that this thing was moving with purpose. I don't know why, but that crossed my mind, that it wasn't just tumbling out of control. It had a purpose to its movements. And as it got closer, it got much bigger. And as it descended from the starlight, we could see a triangular shadow move across the forest below us and come in our direction. And the lights on the tips of each point of the triangle dimmed somewhat, but was still bright enough to illuminate the entire forest below us. And this thing stopped about 3,000 feet over our campsite. And it was hard to grasp its size. At 3,000 feet, we could only see the bottom. We couldn't see the entire structure. We would shortly. What happened next was there were a couple of rays of light that shot out from the thing. And I'll just say that there was a white beam of light that was a visible beam of light. It looked like a high-power searchlight cutting through fog, but of course there was no fog. It was just this visible beam of white light. That was followed a minute later by a laser-like beam. Lasers were a fairly new concept in 1977. I'd seen them on television. I'd never seen one in person. But this laser would land at a spot in the campsite, stay there for a tenth of a second, and then reappear in another location. So it gave the illusion that it was dancing all over our campsite. And I recall thinking, this thing's scanning us, Mm-hmm. It's checking us out. It hit me. I never felt anything. I know it hit my friend, the tent, my car. And that lasted for about 3 minutes. And then it was just Toby and I lying there. And, I don't think there was a word spoke between us, which was just odd.
Were you able to speak?
Oh, absolutely. I could speak, but I was sedated is the best word that I could use. sedated and curiously disinterested, almost apathetic. And my friend stood up. He startled me when he did, and he said, "Show's over." And he grabbed his air mattress and he threw it into the tent, and I followed suit. As soon as I stood up, I realized all I wanted to do was sleep. It was an effort to make it to the tent. I threw my air mattress in. I didn't bother to undress or take my boots off. I just fell onto the air mattress. And my friend's already snoring softly. And the last thought that I had was, "Toby, you were wrong, because the crickets and the tree frogs never did come back." And I was out. I was unconscious. No dreams, just passage of 4 hours. Of course, I had no idea how much time had passed. And I woke up to flashing yellow and white lights. And when I woke up, I didn't have my wits about me, if that makes sense. I was confused, and I thought for a moment, oh yeah, Toby and I are camping. That's where we're at. And these lights, they must be the overhead lights of a camper, a ranger's truck. You know, the park rangers come to kick us out of the park. And I heard this. That's the first time I heard the noise. I heard a low droning noise that I describe as more powerful than loud. And it was kind of akin to if you ever stood next to a locomotive or a large piece of industrial machinery. There's that vibration from the machinery that reverberates in your chest. And that's the noise I heard. And inside the tent, it is absolutely pitch black, except for when these lights would light up the inside of the tent. And they were as brilliant as an old school flash bulb from the 60s, you know.
Yep.
And with one of these flashes of light, I saw my friend on his knees peering outside the tent, looking at something. And Toby was African American, and he had tear tracks down his face that when the light hit, I guess the salt water and the tears against the skin contrasted, and I could clearly see he was crying. He wasn't sobbing, but he was crying with tears rolling down his face. And I was confused, and I was scared. And that's the moment when I realized that we were in some kind of trouble. And all of the feeling of sedation and disinterest and apathy that I felt earlier vanished. And in an instant, I was scared to death. And I got to my knees, and I realized that I was hurt. I was in a lot of pain. And I nudged Toby to the left, and I pulled back a flap of the tent to see what he's looking at. And I saw what I first took to be children, maybe a dozen or 15, and they're paired up in twos and threes, and they're just wandering around this, I call it a meadow at the time. And it struck me so odd. And I said, "Toby, man, what are these kids doing out here in the middle of the night?" And he said, "Terry, man, those ain't no little kids. They took us and they hurt us. They're not human, Terry. They're not human beings, Terry. Look at them."
Wow.
And I did look at them, and he was right. They were not human beings. Their heads were disproportionately large to their bodies. Their torsos were just very, very thin. Their upper limbs were longer than they should have been. And they walked with a very distinctive gait. They walked like they had sore feet, all of them. I don't know what that's from, but that's the way they walked. And that frightened me a lot. While we're watching these little guys, a light turned on from underneath the ship. And it was, again, that same quality of white light, visible light that I experienced earlier. And it was in a column about 30 feet in diameter. Now, I should mention, when we went to bed, this thing was about 3,000 feet over our head. Now, this thing had descended and is 30 feet over our heads. And now we can see the full size of it. And I estimated it to be a city block in length on each leg of the triangle. And it was deep. It was 5 stories deep. It was as if someone levitated a medical building 30 feet over the ground. And while we're watching it, these little guys in groups of 2s and 3s would wander into this column of white light and just dissolve into it and vanish. And we watched until the last 2 walked into the light and vanished. And as soon as they did, the light cut out and the droning noise stopped. The lights that were coming from what I call a light bar, there was a bar that ran from the bottom of the triangle to the very top. That changed in colors from yellowish, greenish, and white to just pure white. And I remember thinking that light runs up and down that light bar, and that's what gives the illusion of a twinkling star when you see it in the sky. And we're just watching, we're terrified, and we saw the thing lift off. And it didn't lift off like a rocket. It just rose up like a hot air balloon, slowly at first. And then the higher it got, the faster it went. And we watched it until it was 3 dots in the sky and then 1 point of light and then gone.
So you say you were in pain. I mean, do you remember what actually happened to you during that missing time?
I have bits and pieces. I do not have a clear linear memory of what happened, but I do have recollection of being inside that thing. As far as our injuries, we were burned. I was burned to a crisp. It was like the worst sunburn you could possibly imagine, short of blistering. I never blistered, but I was burned on the soles of my feet, under my arms, literally every inch of my body. And I felt like I had sand in my eyes. I found out later at the hospital I had what's characterized as arc welder's burn or flash burn. It's what an arc welder would receive if he didn't protect his eyes during welding. And that's a very painful thing. We were afraid to move out of the tent. The tent gave us cover, at least. I felt like if I walked out of the tent or even ran out of the tent, that I'd be vulnerable. I didn't want to be exposed. At least I was hidden underneath that thin layer of canvas. But Toby was right. He said, man, we got to get out of here. He says, I think they're all gone. Let's just get out of here. So with a little encouragement from him, that's what we did. We bolted and ran to my car, and we got in and we drove back to the base. When we got back to the base, our wives took us both to the hospital. And we were admitted to the hospital. I didn't know it at the time, but we were classified as acutely ill due to dehydration. I remember on the drive back being so thirsty. Never in my life had I been so thirsty. And I just could not get enough to drink. My friend Toby was hurt much worse than I was. And he was kind of curled into a fetal position in the front seat of my 66 Chevy that had the large bench seats. And he was hurting. He really was. And he was in no condition to drive a car. So the doctor came in and said, and we both worked at the hospital squadron, so we knew everyone there. It was like family. And a doctor that I knew came in and said, what happened to you guys? Now, I knew that if I told him, and even if Toby backed up my story, if we told him we saw a UFO the size of a medical building, they would have sent us for a psych evaluation. That would have happened, no question in my mind. So we opted to just cut out that part.
Right.
We went camping, we went to bed, we woke up sick as dogs. And that was our story. Park rangers I guess, during the night or sometime in the early morning while we were driving back, must have found that chain down on the road and went in to investigate, and they found our campsite. And we left everything there. So we had, Toby's backpack with his camera in it. The backpack had his name written on it in an indelible marker, along with the phone number and his address at the base. So they knew we were from the air base. And the Rangers must have called the air base and said, a couple of your guys have set up a camp out here, and it looks like they plan to come back because they left everything here. Well, because of the suspicious nature of the campsite and the fact that we had these bizarre injuries, the Office of Security Police and in its investigative branch, the Office of Special Investigations, got involved and came to question us. Another curious thing that happened was the hospital commander, the base commander, and two guys that I think were OSI in blue business suits came into my room. The hospital commander spoke to me, and we had a pretty good relationship. We could have a conversation, but this was a strictly business. And he says, Sergeant Lovelace, you're to have no contact with Sergeant Tobias, not in any way, shape, or form. That means no phone calls, no verbal communication, no notes passed. You're to give him nothing. He's to give you nothing. No contact means not through third parties.
They wanted to see if your stories corroborated.
They wanted to keep us away from one another. They did not want us to get together because I think two witnesses would be more effective than one. And I've heard from a couple other people that had similar experiences while on active duty that was routine. In fact, we were not only ordered to have no contact. My enlistment was coming up. This was June of 77. I was due to get out in 79, so I didn't have much time left. Toby had a little more. And they cut orders for him, PCS they call it, and he shipped out to Japan very fast. And my third night in the hospital, I knew I would be going home the next day. And I was feeling somewhat better, but I kept the lights off for my comfort. And they just run bags of fluid through me. And once they got me rehydrated, I felt somewhat better. And when my nurse came in, she was going to give me an injection for pain. And two guys in business suits followed her in. Not the two guys that were in the hospital when I spoke with the commanding officer. Two different guys. And these guys were cops. I mean, they were plainly cops. And the one gentleman that was in charge, a guy maybe in his late 40s, early 50s, showed me his credentials, that he was, and his badge. And I noted that he was a major in rank. And he was accompanied by a captain who likewise flashed his identification in my direction. And they sat down and interrogated me. And the nurse, he asked the nurse, if that's going to sedate Sergeant Lovelace, it's going to have to wait until we ask him some questions and shut the door on your way out, which was rude. And there was no reason for it to be rude. But, in retrospect, all of what went on was theater, for the purpose of intimidating me, which, I was 22. I had never been in trouble a day in my life. And I was very much intimidated. And my first thought was, oh my God, we burned the forest down or something. So he sat down and he said, well, you boys left your campsite there. The only reason I think you would do that is because maybe you got yourselves a little marijuana plot out there. Is that what's going on here? Is you guys growing some marijuana out there? And I thought, oh my God, what if by happenstance somebody did have some marijuana out there? I mean, active duty in 1977, that would have meant a prison sentence. So I had a very harsh interrogation, but I stuck to the story, went to bed, got up sick, came home. And the captain left. The nurse finally gave me my injection, and it was just me and the major in the room. And he took his hand and he held the door shut. And my bed was right there next to the door. And he bent down next to my ear. And he had this Louisiana accent, kind of like Calvin Parker, if you've ever spoken or heard him speak. So in this accent, he said, "Son, I know, and you two knuckleheads stumbled onto something out there. And I think you know what I mean." And I didn't reply. And he says, "Oh, yeah, you know what I mean." And he turns off this tough guy affect facially and kind of looks like a human being again. And he said to me, "Son, all I want is the film of the pictures that you took of it, and I want your camera. And this will all go away and everything will be just fine."
Wow.
Yeah, wow. Now, I left my good camera at home, which is inexplicable, but it didn't matter. Toby had a camera in his backpack. The thought of taking a picture of this thing never crossed our minds. And I lived to take pictures back in the day.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's another example of how they had control over us.
So were these guys really cops?
Absolutely, they were. They were. They were indeed. They had valid badges and
it sounded like they didn't want this thing to get out and people to see it.
I think that's exactly right. I think that, I had a reputation within the squadron of being an amateur photographer. Matter of fact, I'd made a promise to the hospital commander that I would take Ansel Adams quality black and white prints that would be stunning. And I said, I will frame one for your office. And he said, "Well, I'll hold you to that, Sergeant." So we had a good rapport, but so everyone in the squadron knew that I went down there with the intention of photographing wildlife. So I guess the OSI assumed that that I had taken pictures of it.
Okay, so what happened? What happened since then? I mean, you talk about decades of trauma. I mean, what kind of trauma did you experience?
Within a few weeks, well, the trauma was the physical injury for the first couple of weeks. But after that, I started experiencing nightmares.
Did they have the same theme? Were they themed the same?
They were themed the same. And I thought it would be wise to journal them. And I did. And I documented them. And I could see that some of them were repetitive. As a matter of fact, it was about the same 5 dreams that I'd experienced over and over again. And I've experienced those 5 dreams a lot over the years, lesser. That was 43 years ago. So,
can you share what the dreams kind of were about? Or
I can share one real quick with you because it's the most frightening one that I have.
Mm-hmm.
Toby and I were inside this craft. I think we were inside this craft. The thing that confuses me is that the inside of this thing was 10 times larger than the outside. I mean, it was the inside appeared to be the size of like
a Doctor Who TARDIS.
A stadium. Yeah, and yeah, it was just crazy. And we were frozen. When I say we were frozen, we were standing. We had been stripped and we're holding our clothing in our hands. And we stood side by side. And just like Calvin Parker's experience, we couldn't move anything except our eyes. So my eyes are darting around and I'm trying to take in everything that I'm seeing. And I noticed that number one, I noticed it's a busy place. There are grays and entities running all around. There are golf carts with no wheels zooming around. There are multiple levels to the structure inside. And in the distance, I can see 3 flying saucers, parked just like planes below a carrier deck. And there was this alien entity who appeared almost human-like with a pinkish, chalky complexion. He was not gray. He had only 2 nostrils, no hair, just a slit for ears, a slit for a mouth, and not exaggerated large eyes, but a little about the size of Ray-Bans, that wrapped across the side of his face. And I'm looking at him, and just by coincidence, as I'm looking at him, he turns and we locked eyes. And in the moment, the guy was in my head. That's the best way that I can explain it. He was in my head. He knew me. He knew my wife. He knew my dreams. He knew my secrets, my plans. He knew everything about me. And that's a frightening thing. I mean, it's akin to, I don't know how, I don't have a good analogy for it. And all I got reflected back from those eyes of his was raw intellect, just raw intelligence. Mm-hmm. That's it. No mercy, no empathy, nothing of the sort. For some reason, of all the things of the couple of things that I recall, including being on the examination table, but that exchange when we locked eyes, for me, for some reason, is the most frightening. When I have that dream, when it starts, I can't stop it. It has to run its course, and I usually wake up screaming.
Yeah. Did they implant something inside you?
They did. They did indeed. And I think I sent you some photographs of the x-rays. In 2012, I had an injury to my leg. And, I was a runner. I started running in 1979. And I noticed that every time I would pass the 2-mile mark in my run, there was an area on my right leg just above my knee and lateral that would go completely numb. I mean, it was like Novocaine or some deadening agent. Numb and kind of itchy. And I could take a pin and clearly delineate its edges. And it was about the size of an American $50 or a Canadian toonie. And it would stay numb for about 30 to 40 minutes after I'd completed my run. I asked my physician about it, and she says, it sounds like a histamic reaction to me, probably nothing to worry about. So I didn't for 40 years. And then I woke up one morning, and I couldn't bear weight on my right leg. I had what was called a Baker's cyst. Had nothing at all to do with the objects in my leg. It's just coincidentally, my leg, for whatever reason, developed this cyst that made it painful to bear weight. And when they took the x-rays, that's when they discovered that the object above my knee was square, obviously manufactured item, about the size of your fingernail, with 2 wires that go up. Pictures of it are in the back of my book. There's a second x-ray that shows the lower half of my leg, and in my calf muscle, there's a floral-like arrangement of tic-tac size items, and with a little dot in the middle.
In the book, you mentioned the doctor said it was disturbing. Why would he say that?
He said it was disturbing because, and it's a teaching hospital. He had an intern with him, and I could best describe as arrogant. He walked over to my leg and said, was obviously the product of a trauma, of a car accident, an auto accident, or some type of injury. And he said to his intern, he'll have a scar. It should be right here. And he says, there'll be another one back in the back. But he said, no, he says, I got to admit that the floral arrangement of items in the calf muscle of your leg, he said this speaking to me, on x-ray appear to be the same density as bone tissue. But he says, that puzzles me because I've never seen bone tissue sprout in the middle of a muscle, much less multiple items, and arrange themselves in a pattern. He says, that's really weird. That's really odd. But he says, that I want to look at your leg and find the scar. And he says, don't you recall an injury or accident? I said, look, I've never injured that leg at all. And you're welcome to look because you're not, but I don't have a scar there. And he says, sure you do. Sometimes, they fade with time. And he said he used a handheld blacklight because he was sure that this thing would fluoresce under the blacklight in a dark x-ray room. And he examined my leg for 10 minutes, and he was visibly upset. And I asked him, I said, "Doctor, how often is it that you find a foreign object under the skin like this without there being a corresponding scar?" And he said, "Never." He said, "I've been a radiologist 23 years. He says, I don't know how you can violate the integrity of the skin and bury something that deep in fascia and tissue without there being a scar."
Did you have it removed?
I did not. And I'll tell you why. I wanted it removed. My first thought was, I want this thing out of my body. And I'd had a heart attack in 2005. And I went and I saw several doctors within the VA system where I get my medical care. And they all asked for a cardiac clearance letter because of my prior history of heart disease. And the cardiologist said, "I won't give you a clearance letter because this thing is causing you no problems." He says, it's like, we have thousands of veterans wandering around, with shrapnel in their bodies, and they want it removed too. But we do a risk-benefit analysis. Is the risk worth the benefit? And he says, in your case, it's not. The thing in your leg's not doing anything to you.
Yeah.
And he says, with your cardiac history, I could not get a cardiologist to authorize it.
And of course, by this time, you hadn't told anyone your story. So why did you eventually come out and tell it?
I'm glad you asked that question. I really had no intention of telling it to anyone. My wife and I never told our children. All my children knew was that Dad would have screaming nightmares once or twice a year. And something about seeing that X-ray had a big emotional impact on me because, I had tried to put this 1977 event out of my mind. Seeing that X-ray was actual confirmation that these things, these non-human entities, had laid their hands on me. And that was deeply disturbing. And I felt like I wanted to pursue it and maybe even had a duty to tell the world that, hey, this stuff is real. This stuff really happens to people. I'm not alone out here. There's Calvin Parkers. There's Travis Waltons. There's, thousands of people that maybe live with it suppressed. And if you suppress it long enough, I believe it'll come to the surface and manifest as alcoholism or mental illness or something. And I thought it was cathartic to write the book and speak openly.
So essentially with the object in your leg, it seems like you were tagged. And in the book, you say once you're tagged as their specimen, you're tagged for a lifetime. So do you think they've been monitoring you ever since?
I do. I'll make this brief. The item that looked like a computer chip above my knee was removed, but not by terrestrial surgeons. I woke up one morning and I had bad injuries at the top, curiously, at the top of my leg. I had bad injuries on both legs. And I told my wife, I said, I think they came and they took that thing out of my leg. And I went and got an X-ray, and sure enough, they did. So I have X-rays showing it's there. I have X-rays showing it's not there. But curiously, in the second set of X-rays, even though that RIFD chip or whatever it was is gone, there are two tiny wires parallel to my femur that are left in my leg. The doctor that did the X-ray for me was a very kind chiropractor who I believe was familiar with people who've had experiences. Because I said, Doc, why would these beings, if they're 500 rungs up the evolutionary ladder and so much smarter than we are, how in the world could they leave two wires behind by accident? And he says, no, they don't do anything by accident.
Wow.
That's an upgrade.
Yeah. So they obviously haven't shown up again, but I'm kind of thinking with the nightmares you're having, do you think the nightmares could be a disguise of you being taken again?
I have been taken again.
Oh, you have?
I have.
Okay.
I was taken on April 16th, 2019, and I actually have empirical evidence to prove it. And I can send it to you. I sleep with this iPhone in my pocket, in a t-shirt pocket at night, and I listen to orchestral music. Ambient noises freak me out at night, so I want I don't want to hear the noises. I want to just listen to music. And I plug in my earbuds, and I plug the charger because the iPhone's battery is so poor. I plug the charger into the wall right next to me and stick the whole thing in my pocket. I don't move around a lot while I sleep. I lay on my back, I listen to music, and sleep all night. On April 16th, I got up at 5:55 a.m., completely exhausted and out of breath, thought I was having a heart attack, called an ambulance. My blood pressure was elevated. They thought I was having a heart attack. Well, I didn't have a heart attack. They did, the usual chest x-ray, cardiac enzymes, and EKG, everything's fine, kicked me out, sent me home. When I got home, I felt well enough I told my wife, I'm going to go out and try to walk a little bit. I try to clock a 2-mile walk a day if I can. And I noticed that on the stair application of there's a stair part of the activity log. It records my steps, but it also records stairs. Mm-hmm. And if I climb stairs, it'll show, if I climb 6 flights of stairs, for instance, it would show like a stair step pattern, because the bottom line is an index for time, where the horizontal index represents distance. On my phone, it showed one line. It showed a horizontal line going straight up at 5:24, between 5:23 and 5:24 a.m. According to the phone, I climbed 6 flights of stairs in less than 1 minute. That gave me one single bar. And I took it to the T-Mobile store, and I asked the guy. I said, "What does this mean?" I don't know if you can see this well enough on the phone.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a glare. Yep, now we can. Yep.
Can you see the bottom?
6 floors. Yep.
5:24 a.m.
16th of April.
5:24 a.m. I was asleep next to my wife. There's the single bar.
Wow.
That shows that. Yeah, I get it.
Yep.
T-Mobile says that you were 60 feet above your house at 5:24 a.m.
Okay.
My house has no stairs. I live
Terry,
on a ranch.
Do you think these were benevolent or malevolent aliens? Bad aliens?
I don't think they were benevolent by any stretch of the imagination. Initially, I thought that they were absolutely malevolent. I will say this, there were other humans that were captives on board that ship that were in the same situation we were, immobilized and holding their clothes. And it was a mixed bag of men, women, and children. Mm-hmm. And they kicked us out. But those poor souls were still on that thing when it went up in the air. So I don't know what happened to those people. I don't think they Ubered them home.
No.
But and maybe it's Stockholm syndrome, but my anger and my rage has somewhat softened over the years. And, maybe if I sat down and talked to them, they'd say, "Hey man, just doing my job." I don't know.
Yeah. Just on that point before we're just about ready to close, but you mentioned a moment when you gave a speech in Houston in 2017, and a young attendee asked you something incredible after you gave the speech. Can you share that with us quickly?
I can. This college student stood in line impatiently, waiting to ask me a question. And when he got to me, he says, How can I get him to come take me? And I said, "Have you not been listening to me?
Yeah.
Does this sound like fun to you?" And he says, "Yes, an adventure. I want to go." I said, "Well, I would be careful what I ask for."
Yeah.
Because they probably read your thoughts.
Yeah. We've spoken to Calvin Parker during this summit. Is there some sort of I don't know, use the word club, but guys like Calvin and Travis Walton, do you guys ever get together on occasions? And
you know what? At that 2017 meeting, I wasn't on the roster. I wasn't scheduled to speak. I met Travis Walton there for the first time, and we spoke for a long time. I mean, when I meet somebody that's had the shared experience, we have something in common, and we can relate to one another. Where the average person will look at you and say, "What?" We understand is the way I can put it, best way I can put it.
Yeah, yeah. Has Hollywood come knocking?
They have not, and I devoted a year and a half to writing a motion picture script. And I just have to find someone who'd like to give me an option on it.
Yeah, I think with Hollywood, they like to do that themselves, so they can, I guess in their eyes, they like to make it, I know whether viewer friendly is the right term, but you probably don't get the whole truth.
Yeah. Agreed.
And just before we close, Terry, what are your thoughts on disclosure?
I have a feeling that, well, first of all, December 2017, there was the article in the New York Times by Leslie Kean. Leslie Kean and I were just together recently, and we spoke at Rice University to faculty and PhD candidates on the topic. I spoke on abduction. She spoke on the UFO phenomenon. And that 2017 soft disclosure in Huffington Post, New York Times, and then picked up by CNN, where they showed Lieutenant Commander, or was it Commander Fravers' view through the gun camera and his description of these amazing objects. You know, having been in the military, I know that a commander doesn't unilaterally go on television and disclose things like that and have access to gun camera footage unless the United States government authorizes it and provides him with the material. So that, to me, was a soft disclosure. I think there's going to be an event this February. You know, I've talked to people a lot over the past 2 years, and you'd be amazed how many people come to me and say, you know what, I just have this sense of urgency that's I can't define, but I feel like something's going to happen. Now, you know, that's a really vague thing. And when I say I have the strong feeling something's going to happen in February of 2020, I don't want to cause panic. I don't think it's anything that's going to cause riots in Hong Kong. Well, maybe that's not a good example. Or riots in New York City or Beijing, for sure. But I think something's going to happen on a global scale. And that's a heck of a statement to make, because I base my credibility on that. And I could lose my credibility if it doesn't happen. And there are lots of factors. You know, my information might be wrong, but that's what I get.
Yeah. Have you ever given thought to what a post-disclosure world would look like? Would there be much change?
Well, I hope there would be a lot of change, because I think that the entity that I'm in contact with tells me that the Earth is in serious trouble. Well, I think we all recognize that. And she says the reason for that is that nations, governments act regionally, you know, and act in their own interest. And this entity, I refer to her as Betty, told me that your world needs to think globally, to eliminate borders, to feed the hungry, because you have the resources, to clean up the atmosphere, and raise your consciousness. And she said, if you can do that, you can join the universe. You can join the rest of us. And she says, if you can't, your planet will self-destruct. It's a sobering thought.
It certainly is. And there's that word consciousness again. And I guess that, to me, is the key word. Terry, fascinating discussion. I'm glad you came out and told your story. Your book's called Incident at Devil's Den, and of course it's available on Amazon, I guess all good book places.
It's available only on Amazon currently, in Kindle, paperback with the photographs and x-rays, And there's also an audio version that people seem to like. Done in my own voice, I tell the whole story.
Yep. Okay, great. Terry, good luck and stay in touch, and we really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Dean. Likewise.
That's contact experiencer and author Terry Lovelace. A UFO investigator can seem like a glamorous job. Perhaps that's the impression given by Hollywood. The truth is, if you like to interview people, are good with numbers and have a nose for solving a mystery, you're probably a good fit for becoming a field investigator. The main ingredient, though, is one that many won't think about. A UFO investigator needs to have a slight dose of healthy skepticism. This fact was borne home recently in our interview with ace investigator Chuck Zukowski, and backed up recently by top Southern California UFO sleuth Earl Grey Anderson.
They are everywhere. I had one woman, she put in a UFO report, and she said that a UFO was hovering over her daughter's high school graduation. And the more I talked with her, the more familiar this UFO sounded. And finally I said, did they take like overhead film of your daughter's graduation? And it's like, oh yes, it's a lovely film. It's like, I think that I know what your UFO was. And I explained to her what she was what she was describing. And and you have to be sweet to people,
Yeah.
It's not like I said, well, you saw a drone, and you silly person. No, if somebody hasn't seen something like that, I mean, that's another thing, and I think a service that MUFON provides for people is to explain what they saw, if we're able to figure out what prosaic object that was.
Yeah.
But, then we have other cases where, I had one case that was in Azusa, California here, where there were two women who took chase after a UFO, and they got caught in a cul-de-sac. And they saw it was two objects. They were orb-shaped spherical UFOs, and they were heading towards the San Gabriel Mountains there. And they got caught in a cul-de-sac where they couldn't get out, and they thought that their chase was over. And suddenly there was this bright light that was off to the side, and they turned around, and there's this thing that looked like it came out of a science fiction film, hovering soundlessly over this house, less than 100 feet away from them. It's a pretty wild story, but what was interesting is that there was a gentleman in the next town over, about 3 miles away, who also put in a report of the exact same thing.
Right.
So we had multiple witnesses that were unconnected, and the deeper that I went into that case, the more it seemed to manifest for me that something very unusual and very strange had happened in this little town.
One of California's top UFO field investigators, Earl Grey Anderson, says earning the trust of the people making the report is important. Anderson says a UFO investigator first needs to understand where the person making the report is coming from. He says they've seen something in the sky and were told they don't exist. They are dealing with a little personal shock of their own. That's coming up next week on the Aliens Revealed Live Files. Thanks for being with us once again. Don't forget to check out our site at arlhub.com. That's arlhub.com. And as always, keep looking upwards and take care.